market are avoidance offsets. So you can do things like pay someone not to chop down a forest or not to convert land to a degraded use, or you can buy renewable energy credits. But the bottom of this tree is actually carbon removal and storage. So removing atmospheric carbon, technologies that do that. There are a number of tech-based options, carbon capture and storage, direct air capture, the giant carbon sucking machines that'll remove CO2 from the sky. Those tend to be very expensive solutions. And then we have nature. People are very familiar usually with forestry, planting new forests, but not as much with soil carbon storage. But this is a solution at a scale on par with some of these other technological solutions. And that's one of the reasons why we started Grassroots Carbon, is to help that nature-based solution scale up. So companies are actually ascending a staircase. We sometimes like to talk about the staircase of the sustainability pathway. If you look at the sort of litany of announcements coming out every day and every week, more and more companies are not even starting at the bottom of the staircase with business as usual anymore. We're giving birth to companies that are coming out with millennial CEOs and are starting from a position of wanting to be carbon neutral. And so what soil carbon storage does is actually provide an option for your portfolio that gets you on this pathway towards regenerative, because I think this really is the future for what we used to call corporate sustainability. It's going from causing less harm to actually taking an active role in restoring the earth and being part of the circular economy of the future. Okay, so in that decision tree of carbon removal options, companies are generally looking for these 7 things. It needs to be real atmospheric carbon reduction. It needs to be available at scale. It's great as if it can also offer additional benefits beyond just the carbon. It needs to be trusted by stakeholders, credible, measured, accepted. It needs to be permanent and affordable. So I'm going to step through these really quickly in turn and talk about how soil carbon storage ticks those boxes. First of all, is it real? So to get there, we have to talk about how this technology actually works. Sometimes we get asked by potential customers, okay, but where are you going to put the carbon pumps and where are the pipelines going to go? And the thing about soil carbon storage using grasslands is that the plants are the pump. This tech solution is actually employing nature's ancient technology of photosynthesis, which is all the time happening. It's naturally taking CO2 from the air and with water and sunlight and creating plant biomass. And part of the sugars that are created from that CO2 go out through the roots of the plant and feed the soil microbes, and therefore get incorporated into the soil matrix. So when you take degraded lands that might have been plowed or otherwise degraded and planted with little short turf grasses like you see on the left hand of the slide, and you resurrect the native prairie and you restore those lands to healthy grassland ecosystems, you can see that native prairie plants have these long, deep roots, 6 to 9 feet. And that process of restoring helps sequester carbon much deeper. So it actually takes CO2 out of the air and stores it in the soil on a time scale essentially permanent in human terms. How much CO2 per acre per year can you store? Anywhere from 0.5 ton to more than 4 tons per acre per year, every year using soils. It's a range because it has to do with things like climate, rainfall, and importantly, the land management practices that you're using. So it is real. Is it available at scale? If you just look at the US lower 48, we've got over 650 million acres of land used for grazing. That's about 40% of our land area. So with our carbon footprint in the US of 6.6 billion metric tons per year, if suddenly you could restore, if you took half of the grasslands that we had and you started restoring them in such a way that they're bringing back the native prairie and being managed in an intensive grazing situation that mimics the bison on the prairie, we could be storing over 1 billion tons of CO2 per year, every year, just in US grasslands. So that's somewhere in the realm of 10 to 23% of the entire US carbon footprint. That's the potential. And so it's such a massive potential carbon sponge that we're standing on top of. That's one of the reasons why we started this company, was to really go after unlocking this at scale in the US. So the trick is you have to change how you manage those lands. And so what this slide is showing is a fence line picture. Here on the left-hand side, you can see a fence line picture where on the right, that land is being conventionally managed, and on the left, it's being intensively adaptively grazed to mimic the bison on the open prairie. Most people are not grazing their herds in this way, but this is the key. It's a human change management to unlock this technology. So what this cartoon is showing, continuous grazing, in general, most people let the herd wander freely throughout the property. With adaptive multi-paddock grazing, or sometimes they call it holistic management, you'll hear different terms. What it's doing is you are mimicking the situation in which the grassland co-evolved with migrating herds of animals that would come in, graze very intensively, and then leave, and the land would rest for long periods of time. So you can mimic that on your ranch by fencing in, using temporary portable fencing, the herd into smaller paddocks. It's grazed down very, to more than 50% of the plant growth, and then the herd is moved off very frequently, sometimes daily or even more. And the land rests for a long time, hundreds of days, months, but it's adaptive. So instead of fighting nature, this is a way of grazing where you're actually working with nature, responding to what the weather is doing, how the plants are recovering, and mimicking that natural ecosystem. And one of the great things about soil carbon storage as a climate and carbon removal technology is that it doesn't require land use change. We don't have to go do long lead items and build pipelines and big heavy CapEx projects. We don't have to plant new forests where there wasn't a forest before. We simply have to change how existing grazing lands are managed. The ranchers really are the key. That's one of the reasons why our company, which was formerly called Soil Value Exchange, we recently merged with a company called PastureMap. PastureMap, we're keeping this brand. PastureMap provides grazing management software. So many of the ranchers who are doing these practices, they need a grazing plan to manage their ranch. And what PastureMap offers is an easy electronic way to do that. You can get your entire team on the same page and actually look virtually at where your herd has been and how long the lands have rested and how the plant community is recovering. So this is a data platform that's going to allow us to store the soil carbon data and some of the interaction with the certifying entity in this tool. And PastureMap is used by grazing managers on over 4 million acres. So with this tool and with access to a 4 million acre wide rancher network, we now can really offer soil carbon storage on the order of millions of tons a year. So it's a really big step forward for what we're trying to do. Okay, so that's the scale piece. Now, what about additional benefits beyond carbon? Well, I am really partial to this part of the presentation because I actually think that the additional benefits of soil carbon storage are more exciting than the carbon removal. Sometimes we talk about soil carbon storage plus. Not only, when you restore grasslands, not only are you storing a whole lot of carbon underground, but you are also restoring rangeland ecology at scale. So healthy grassland soils, that's the foundation of an ecosystem. And so when you restore the soil, you get a broader diversity and abundance of plants that can support more pollinators, that can support more birds, and the entire ecosystem begins to recover. Healthy soils also store a lot more water. It prevents erosion. And importantly, in the long run, grazing in this way is actually more profitable for the farmer or rancher. There are some transition costs. You do have to pay a not insignificant amount usually to install a water system to get water to your herds. And we're excited to start working, hopefully, on helping people ease that transition and access low-cost financing. But in the long run, it is more profitable. And so this is really a tool to revitalize rural communities if we could do it at scale. And that's part of the intent behind our public benefit company. Here's a picture that speaks to the water infiltration aspect of restoring soils. This is from Gabe Brown's ranch in North Dakota. Before he started, that land was continuously grazed conventionally, and the soils could only absorb about 1 inch an hour of rain. So those heavy thunderstorms like we get around here would just have runoff. after been doing adaptive multi-paddock grazing for a few years, his land can now absorb more than 8 inches per hour into the soil because more roots. And so that can actually improve water quality. It can mean that your seeps and springs on your property are refreshed and that you're not, eroding the topsoil away. It's not a new technology, of course. Photosynthesis, ancient technology, and also these techniques are not new, although they are not widely practiced in the US. We think that less than 2% of ranchers in this country are doing holistic management or adaptive grazing, but there's a whole bunch of books. You could fill your bookshelf with books about this. And there's a bunch of very interesting 12-minute movies made by Peter Bick, and there's now a feature-length film on Netflix that I really encourage everybody to watch. It's called Kiss the Ground. It's down here at the bottom right. And it's got ranchers talking in their own words about the changes they've seen in their lives and on their land from doing some of these practices. Okay, so that's the additional benefit. Now, is it trusted? Here, I like to back up and remind people about where carbon actually exists in our Earth. So most of the carbon stocks on Earth are in the oceans. But what a lot of people don't know is that near surface soil, the top 3 feet, contains more carbon than the entirety of the atmosphere and all plant biomass on Earth combined. We talked about additional benefits already, so I'm going to kind of skip a little bit of this, but this solution of soil carbon storage, it's a technology that essentially touches many of the sustainable development goals that companies are looking to reach, not just things like climate action and life on land, like you might expect, but also that community aspect, goal number 11. So how is grassroots carbon faring in trying to scale this up? On this slide, we've got a few of our customers listed. I mentioned Shopify and Marathon. We're also working with a European beauty brand and Rapid7, which is a big data IT company. And we are in a due diligence process with many others across all industry sectors. We're seeing a huge uptick in interest in nature-based climate solutions. These companies are not the only one. Shell, who of course, as many others of the big companies, has made a net zero by 2050 commitment, has come out and said that nature-based climate solutions, carbon removal using nature, is going to be a big piece of offsetting or storing their scope 3 emissions, the emissions from their customers' use of their product, which is the vast majority of the pie when you're in the energy industry. So they're looking to purchase on the order of more than 100 million tons of CO2 removal every year from forests, wetlands, and soil. So these solutions like nature-based soil carbon removal are increasingly becoming the norm for people talking about a portfolio of potential carbon removal. And this is Loy, one of our ranchers that we're working with. Of course, we can't deliver this at scale without building and maintaining and keeping the trust of ranchers. They need to be provided with a good economic deal and a reason to want to participate in carbon markets. Okay, so let's talk about measurement, credibility, and acceptance of the credits. This slide shows the parties to a carbon transaction. You have ranchers on one side providing the soil carbon storage by the techniques that they're using, and then you have the buyer on the right. Grassroots carbon is what we call an assembler, or sometimes called a broker. It's sort of like working with a realtor to sell your house. So a rancher could contract directly with the soil carbon storage buyer, but large companies just can't deal with hundreds of ranchers. And so that's where it's helpful to use an assembler. We take actual soil carbon measurements on the ranch. So we have a contractor company that's an expert in doing so that works with us. These are the logos of one of the companies we're using now. And then an important third party is you need an independent third party who has no vested interest in how much carbon was stored or how many credits are issued to do that very important audit function. And that's where the verifier and the certifier come in. And so for 2021, we've chosen to work with the B Carbon standard. They will be the certifying entity who will certify and stamp these carbon removal credits. They are a new soil carbon standard that was created to create the most rigorous soil carbon storage credits available, backed up by actual soil measurements. How it works under B carbon is we are only selling the absolute measured increase in soil carbon accrual over time. So we're not giving credit for people doing less bad or reducing fertilizer usage or anything like that. It's simply a measured increase. You come in, you measure a certain amount of carbon in the soil organic carbon pool, you come back again in 3 to 5 years and measure again. In this example, if you've increased 15 tons over that 5-year period, that was 3 tons per acre per year, and that's what you can sell. You can sell that measured increase. So no matter what practices a rancher might be doing, if they're not actually storing carbon, then there's nothing to sell. Because we don't want to make people wait 5 years to get paid, that's not a very good proposition. B carbon allows a very, very conservative estimate, which they must certify in advance to allow you to pay people in advance on a very conservative estimate after that first set of measurements has been taken. So you go out and measure, you make the estimate based on published literature values or models or what you see. That estimate is certified by B carbon. The measurement themselves are certified by B carbon, and then you can issue a credit. When you come to year 5 and you true up the actuals, if you've done your estimating right, you've actually stored more than what you have sold, and then the landowner can market the rest and get paid for the actual soil storage. Sampling is a little more complicated than just one sample. There's a whole statistical methodology that goes into setting random sample locations in the right soil strata. I'm not going to get into that too much today, but just to say that the sampling protocol that we're using, that B carbon is allowing for use, was actually developed 10 years ago for use under Verra, which is another leading voluntary carbon offset standard. It simply hasn't been used. And so for a variety of reasons, so B carbon is allowing that one to be used. Okay, so that's the credibility and certification. Now let's talk permanence. Some people look at nature and think that it seems very fragile. But in fact, soil carbon storage is very robust. Once you get past the first few centimeters, soil that is stored down beneath that stays for on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of years, depending on where you are climate-wise, as long as you don't plow it up, till it, or otherwise disturb it. And so unlike forests that can burn down or be eaten by pests, soil carbon storage, as long as you don't deeply till, it stays. So it is actually very robust. Under B carbon, there's a 10-year rolling permanence commitment. So every year that a landowner is getting paid for storing carbon backed up by those soil measurements, he commits to preserve and not till for at least 10 years. So if he gets paid in 2021 for the carbon he stores this year, he's on the hook till 2031. Next year, it would extend it to 2032 and so on. There's also a buffer, like an insurance policy, in case someone doesn't honor their contract, that B carbon would release a certain number of tons so that the buyer is always made whole. But probably the best insurance is that these practices, people don't tend to go back once they've started, because they're simply so much more profitable and it improves the land so much. Okay, I'm getting towards the end. Let's talk about cost. Soil carbon storage it's pretty affordable. It's a lot cheaper than some of those technological solutions I showed on the decision tree. It is more expensive right now than forestry. Price can vary, but in this example, if we're selling it for $20 per ton of CO2 equivalent, the soil measurements are actually very expensive right now. Tech is developing, but right now we can't do measurement by remote sensing. We have to actually take the soil cores. So what grassroots carbon does is we pay landowners 80% of the carbon profits, period. So in the first year, when those expensive measurements are taken, the landowner doesn't have to pay anything out of their own pocket. We're paying for them, but they're not going to get a very big carbon payment because the measurements are so expensive in that year. But then in the second year, when there's no measurement taken, then they start really seeing the value. And then the remaining 20% of the profit goes to us to continue to find buyers and to market their credits for them. Okay, I'm almost at the end. I don't want to go through too much more of this. I just will say that the way that we like to partner with companies is many companies have not really thought much about nature-based solutions. For those kind of companies, we sometimes do pilot projects on a smaller scale so that they can learn about soil carbon storage, they can learn about bee carbon. We also have longer term partnerships that we do where you can lock in more price flexibility over time and maybe increase or decrease how much you want to purchase every year. We have a lot of different ways that we can collaborate. I'm going to end it there, Hank, and just invite any questions that have come up in the chat.
Yeah, thank you so much, Megan. The questions are streaming in. So let me ask you a couple of questions. What is the risk of fire? Will you lose all the soil carbon?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, in fact, fire has a natural role in grassland ecosystems. So it's not so much a deal breaker in grasslands like it is in forests.
So how would you convince ranchers or farmers to change their practices?
Also a great question. This is really the trick with unlocking this technology at scale. I think that what we're seeing that works best is, of course, building trust in community peer-to-peer interactions. You don't want a bunch of people, like me and Henk coming in who aren't ranchers. I'm 3 generations off the farm. They need to hear about it in general from a peer. And we are lucky enough to be working with some of the pioneers who have already started doing these practices and know how to do them and train others. And so it's really through ag extensions and other nonprofits that train ranchers in these techniques, people like Holistic Management International, Savory, those kind of groups.
There's a couple of questions about scale and the minimum size. So what is the minimum size of a ranch or farm that can participate?
Well, in principle, there's no minimum size, and we hope that in the future, we're going to be able to work with all kinds of landowners all over the place. When we got started, since our company has really only existed since 2019, so in the early days, we had to work with larger landowners simply because the measurement costs are so expensive. But those costs are coming down, and I think as time goes on, we'll be able to work with much smaller land holdings. So I would say I'm not going to rule anything out, and the idea is contact us. But in the early days, it was probably on the order of 1,000 acres. But I would say that going forward, it's really a call us.
So can you tell me again scale? There's a lot of questions about scale. So you said this is a carbon storage solution at a scale that matters. So give me an indication of the scale you actually need to have an impact.
Wow, goodness gracious. Well, we didn't start this company to just do a couple pilot projects. We started this because of the map that I showed, where we have essentially 40% of our land area is more or less degraded grasslands that have been overgrazed and or plowed and or used for row crops. And I think I showed on that slide that we're talking about 1 billion tons a year, or a material piece of the entire nation's carbon footprint. That's the potential that's available. It's not going to happen overnight. In fact, it's not going to happen at all unless we can, show with market signals that there's a demand for soil carbon removal. And I think there is. I think it needs to be credible and meet all those criteria that I showed.
Okay, cool. So what is the resistance from landowners to participate? Is there any resistance? How hard is it for them to participate?
Do you mean in terms of participating in carbon markets?
Yeah, so I think the audience asked the question from what resistance do you get?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. First of all, there are lots of others entering this space. It's sort of like the carbon removal Wild West. And so for farmers, there's a number of companies, not so much in the grazing space, but definitely for row crops. And they want to know, who can we trust? They're just kind of suspicious. Can I really trust you? Are you really going to be transparent? There's not been a lot of transparency about the offer to farmers. How much are you keeping and why? What do you need it for? Why don't I get all the benefit if I'm the one providing these benefits? So we're trying with Grassroots to be the most transparent and give the best economic deal to ranchers. And only time will tell whether we, have been able to deserve and earn their trust. I think trust is really earned. That's one of the challenges.
I have another landowner related question. So if you're already practicing regenerative grazing, or you've already converted your land to these grazing practices, can you still participate, or are you out?
You can with the bee carbon, but only to the extent that you continue to store, because it's all based on the measurements. What we do know is that with regenerative land management, you're likely going to continue to accrue carbon for many decades. So even if you've been doing this for probably 10 years, you're probably still accruing carbon, and you should participate. It's a measured increase that's being sold.
Can you repeat again some numbers, how much CO2 can actually be stored per acre? Because that was in your slides, but let's push that.
It highly depends on several things. It depends on how much rainfall, if you're in an arid region, it accrues much more slowly. But the main driver is the land management practices themselves. So if you're not doing regenerative, chances are you're probably not going to be storing very much carbon, especially if you're in the arid, dry West. If you are in the arid, dry West and you've taken land that's been highly degraded and you've converted it and you just started, it's faster in the early years, you could be storing quite a bit. So tons per acre per year, I think on that slide I showed anywhere from a half a ton per acre per year in the really arid places where you've been doing it a long time, to over 4. In some parts of the country that are the sweet spot for this, I think they've measured as much as 6 to 10 tons per acre per year, but that would only be for the very best, most wonderfully managed ranches in the very wettest, highest growing season areas.
Okay, so you said you're already working with landowners, you're actually at the point of starting to pay them. So how important are these payments actually to landowners? Does it matter?
Oh, absolutely it does. Even at a $20 carbon price or a $15 a ton carbon price, which is way less than what the government is talking about at 50, these can be life-changing payments if you have a large ranch. Of course, people that have a large ranch might already have money, and so that's why we're hopeful to be able to bring in more people who are just thinking about transitioning to these practices, especially for people that are in kind of the, Midwest in the sweet spot for this. It could really be transformational.
Okay. Hey, this is a TCC webinar, so there's a lot of participants from the medical industry and the oil and gas industry, and all those technologies available in Houston. These guys do a lot of measurements and imaging. So tell me a little bit again, what is the challenge when you measure soil carbon, and what can we maybe learn from what the medical industry is doing and what the oil and gas industry is doing?
Yeah, well, I got my start as a reservoir engineer. So it's very analogous to trying to figure out how much oil is down in a very vast reservoir that you can't literally see down into, and you can only drill a few expensive holes. So then you have to use statistics and probability to get to a much more scientific estimate about what's down there. Right now, that's very expensive and it's pretty old fashioned, right? We're sending crews out into the field, drilling holes with this Giddings unit, but there's a lot of effort to develop, near infrared sensors to better tune with remote sensing. There's things you could do with airplanes. You can purchase satellite images and then correlate those to soil carbon content. The thing is that so far the satellite correlations are really only valid down to the first shallow 10 to 20 centimeters. And a lot of the carbon storage gets missed that way. And that's actually the most fragile because that's the easiest to till up. So I think this area is still emerging, and we're actually going to be trialing a near handheld infrared sensor in our soil campaign that's coming up soon. But I think we're still probably 2 to 5 years away from those being valid, commercial, and cheap enough.
So if you could post your challenge to the participants in this webinar, what would be your measurement challenge? What are you looking for?
Oh, I have a lot of ideas about this. I think that we need, they have the X Prize in Houston. We have so much intellectual firepower here looking at downhole tools. What we need is a downhole tool that is multifunctional and cheap and robust and can be put on the end and punched down into the soil, but to measure carbon in the near surface, not the deep subsurface, just like we have with downhole tools that like Baker Hughes or Schlumberger is pioneering. The trick is in the correlation. It has to be multifunctional. You're not just measuring one parameter, but it's very analogous to what we're doing and what we've done in oil and gas. And so it's just a matter of applying our know-how to a different problem.
Okay, so back to questions on scale. So what is your largest blocker to reach scale at this point in time? What is the most difficult part here?
Oh, do I have to pick just one?
Well, mention three otherwise.
Well, so I think measurement cost is an issue, but I think that one will come in time. I really think that we need buyers. We need buyers because the ranchers are the key. They have to want to change. Money is a great motivator for people that aren't just attuned to this and aren't experimenters. It's hard to change, and they take a lot of risk. If people come and we make large purchases and they see their neighbor getting a $400,000 a year carbon payment, I guarantee you that will bring more people into oh, I'm curious about this.
Okay, cool. We have participants from Europe even, so that's fantastic. So is this a USA story? Will this work in Europe? Will it work globally? Can you explain that a little bit?
This works on every grassland everywhere. Australia, South Africa, South America. Grassroots carbon, we started in the US. We may expand later, but no, this is global. And in fact, the B carbon standard that we've chosen to work with for this year also has a pilot project running in the UK.
Okay.
Yeah.
Even in the UK. So if there is a potential buyer who wants to buy something from Grassroots Carbon, you can deliver it also in Europe, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Belgium?
In time, not tomorrow, but I think it's worth a conversation for sure. Okay. Because the technique work everywhere.
You talked a few times about the B carbon standard. So why is there a new standard? Because you said it was a new standard. Why is it new?
Yeah, well, one of the reasons why a new standard was required is because under the existing voluntary offset standards, they're very rigorous. They share many of the same hallmarks that B carbon has, but one important factor is that they're not very landowner friendly. The permanence requirement under those standards is essentially very long contracts, 40 to 100 years. And most private landowners in the United States will not sign a 40 to 100-year contract. They're not going to commit their heirs to not have flexibility on what they do on the land. Once people do sign with us, of course, there's that 10-year rolling. 10 years was just about the maximum we could get people to really commit to and feel safe and trusted. So that's one of the reasons.
I got a question about what is the downside for landowners to participate? So what is a risk for them? Well,
one of the risks could be that another competitor comes up tomorrow that offers a better deal. We hope not, but there's always the fear of missing out risk.
Is there a downside for regenerative practices on their land?
Well, I would say probably not. However, there is a transition cost, and it's not insignificant. Some people have spent upwards of $100,000 or more installing water piping. Okay. A lot of ranchers don't just have $200,000 sitting around. And so that's a big risk. And I think that's one of the big barriers for a lot of people.
Where the soil carbon payments actually will reduce that barrier,
yes.
Make it happen? Okay, excellent.
But it's also I think a philosophical, just sort of a mindset shift, right? It's hard to take a risk anyway, but to do something that you haven't really heard about before, I think they need to hear it from a peer. And that's why peer-to-peer networking is part of what we're exploring with Grassroots.
Okay. Quick question. So can you compare soil carbon storage with forestry storage? And any pros or cons?
Pros, it's more secure because it can't burn down. There's no land use change required since we already have so many acres of degraded grasslands that need restoring. Cons, it's more expensive. You can go buy a forestry offset credit for probably $4 right now or even less. A pro of grassland, at least Grassroots credits that we're offering, is they're in the US. So if you're based here, you don't have to worry about some of the forestry credits have gotten some criticism because they're for avoidances or for, well, this would have happened on this land. We don't do avoidances. We are only actual measured certified removal.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this regenerative grazing, I think it doesn't require any fertilizer or pesticides or antibiotics or all that type of stuff. So what opposition do you get from big agricultural companies? because you might take their profit away.
Well, yeah, we haven't spent a lot of time talking with big agriculture companies, but I think that if this took off like wildfire among ranchers, in a way it could kind of be a threat because, you know, grass-fed, grass-finished beef, for example, it's not going to go to the feedlot and be finished on corn. And we're growing a lot of corn to support those grazers. So, you know, I think the beauty of bee carbon and what we're trying to do is that we're not dictating practices. So if a farmer feels like he really still needs to use some kind of fly control or dewormer product, that's fine. You know, it all comes down to whether you actually improved soil carbon or not. That's what you get paid for. And so you do have flexibility there.
Okay, so if a company wants to know more about how soil carbon storage can help them in reducing their carbon footprint, what do they need to do?
Oh, well, they should call me.
Oh, they should
Let me
call.
put up my slide. They should reach out to Grassroots Carbon. Go to our website. It's buildgrassroots.com. Yeah, and call us. You can participate. You know, we're everywhere in Houston right now. We have 2 offices, Houston and San Antonio. Yeah, call us, check out our website, watch Kiss the Ground.
So how difficult is it for a company actually to start doing this?
Oh, we have credits available now. We're heading out to the field to measure. We have a Texas measurement campaign coming up in May, and then some more ranches further north in sort of the Dakotas, Nebraska, Montana area in the summer. So we can provide pretty much instantly on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of tons per year. And then if you are looking for a much bigger purchase on the order of millions, that's going to take a little bit of time.
Okay.
But yeah, we're open for business now.
I think we're running out of time almost. There's so many questions. Can you briefly explain again the difference between a carbon offset and what you try to offer a carbon storage credit?
It's a little confusing because if you drew a chart of the world of carbon offsets, some offsets are what they call avoidance offsets, where you're making an assumption that because you purchased this offset, someone has avoided doing some emitting somewhere. So examples of avoidances are things like renewable energy credits. There's an assumption made when you purchase a certain amount of renewable energy that an equivalent amount of fossil fuel energy will not be used. There's not a lot of rigor behind that assertion, but there it is. That's an avoidance offset. You can pay someone to not chop down a forest. You can say, if I had not purchased this offset, then this amount of land would have been raised and that forest would be gone and it would have released that carbon. That's an avoidance offset. A subset of offsets are what we would call removal offsets. It's confusing. So we just avoid the word offset altogether because removal is fundamentally different. That is planting a new forest where no forest existed before. So it's literally the biomass of those trees is an expression of carbon that has come out of the atmosphere and gone into that tree. Same with soil carbon storage. It's, you know, that restored soil is an expression of CO2 that has been sucked out of the air and put securely down into the soil.
So it's basically kind of a soil CCS, soil capture.
Yes.
Okay, excellent, cool.
Soil carbon capture and sequestration.
So back to scale. So how large can this be in the United States and what do you think grassroots carbon can deliver in, let's say, 5 years from now?
It could be 1 billion tons a year. And I certainly hope that within 5 years, we're delivering 100 million.
Okay, that's a lot of carbon.
Yeah, why not? It needs to be done.
A question about the water pipes. Why do we need to be installing water pipes on ranches? What is the issue there?
You don't necessarily have to put in pipes. You do have, your animals have to drink water. So if you have a very large ranch and you're moving them into these very small paddocks over and over again that are migrating all over your ranch, you have to get the water to them somehow because you're not going to allow them to wander way over to the other side to drink. So either you put in piping, which is very expensive, or you rig up a portable water source, or you have multitude of different water sources located throughout the ranch.
Okay, fantastic. I think that's Mark. Any questions from you while you're listening to the story?
No, I think this was just such a great topic. It was so informative for everybody, for myself particularly. And I think, you know, I encourage everybody to reach out also to Megan and finish answering all these questions. There were so many. And again, the TCC stands ready to help connect as well to Megan and Henk. I think, Megan, you brought up a good point. There are challenges, and we like to obviously post these challenges and connect companies, with you. And I think Henk brought up a good point there with all the imaging and medical community and oil and gas that we have. I think we can solve some of these measurement, economies. Yeah.
Yeah, from my side, thank you so much for asking many questions in the chat and the Q&A. Much appreciated. And please do contact the TCC if you want to know more, or contact Megan directly if you're interested to learn more about soil carbon storage. Thank you so much for attending.